Hi, this is Abby from Witchcraft Criminal History. How you doing today? Hopefully you're doing well. Alright, I'm going to do this video on Jack the Ripper. This is part one because this is a big, major, case. There's tons of information and I actually know an awful lot about this case. Okay, so this is part one, and please, don't just watch part one, please. I encourage you to watch part two, and there might be a part three because this is a massive case. Alright. Jack the Ripper. If anybody knows, the English history a little bit, Jack the Ripper was in Victorian times in England, to be precisely in the year 1888. I think he killed in spring 1888. He has killed 5 women. What they call the nautical 5, I think they call it. But there is suspicions like Martha Tabram, which they think could also be a Ripper victim. However, she's not part of the Chronicle 5, or the ones with a no were Jack the Ripper. And also they have suspicions about his last victim, Mary Kelly. I think her name is Mary Ann Kelly. And the reason why they have suspicions whether Mary Kelly was a victim of Jack the Ripper, because the simple fact was Mary Kelly was brutally murdered. She was destroyed. Mary Kelly was well and truly destroyed. Her body was destroyed. She was only discovered when the landlord came around to pick up the rent. And when he peeked through a broken window, he saw something I reckon would have scarred him for the rest of his life. Because, like I said, she was totally destroyed. Like, flesh from her, from one of her thighs was completely removed. You could actually see photos. You can actually see the bone in the thigh from where the flesh was removed. Her heart has never been found. Her heart was removed. I think her liver was put underneath her head. Her skull, or her skin, was pretty much removed from her skull. So she had literally no face. I think all of her intestinal organs, I think including the lungs, were put on the table next to her. And, she was completely destroyed. And people were wondering, is she really a victim of Jack the Ripper? Like, yes, Jack the Ripper mutilated women. That was true. That's very, very true. But what's unlike the Jack the Ripper murders, like with Polly Nichols, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Polly Nichols. I'm not quite sure if I said Polly Nichols. Because with all of those ones, with Liz Stride and that, when they were murdered outside. All their bodies were murdered outside, while Mary Kelly was murdered in her own home. Fair enough. All of his victims were pretty much quote unquote homeless at the time of their murders, pretty much, and they pretty much had to pay some money to stay at a doss house. If you want to know what a doss house is, a doss house is pretty much where you say like a shelter, like a motel, like a motel, a hotel. But in these doss houses, you had to pay money. You paid money for a room. You paid money even just to be on the premises. You paid maybe a couple pence just to have one area there to sleep. And that's anywhere in that building, not a room. And back in 1888, there was a crisis happening in London. And I think this probably would have been a global aspect as well, because as you would probably know, that modern days, from the 1980s, especially the 1970s, the 1960s in particular, a lot of people who were in prostitution were pretty much on drugs, like Class A drugs. So this is like heroin, cocaine, opium, ice, methamphetamines, those type of drugs. But in the 1800s, especially in 1888, it was alcohol. You know, they were dependent on alcohol. They were alcoholics. So a lot of the victims, you know, were alcoholics. Like, I think it was Polly Nichols. And I'm going to go into more precise details in part 2 and possibly part 3. So this is going to be a very, very long video because there's plenty to talk about. That figure was Polly Nichols, who got kicked out of a doss house because she didn't have, the pence for somewhere to stay. She was eating a baked potato because that was all she had. And they threw her out because she didn't have any money to stay there. Stay even on the premises. And the last words that she said to the doss house owner, "Oh, I can easily get that money. Look at my pretty bonnet. I got a pretty bonnet, I can easily get that money." That was the last time, and the last time she was ever seen alive. The sad thing was that with her, she was already dying. If Jack the Ripper didn't take her away, she would have died of natural causes weeks, maybe even months afterwards. So her time was up anyway. But that's just to show, you know, what these women did. Because back in 1888, women had little to no rights. You also had the Poorman Act. And Poorman Act was definitely around in 1888, around the late 1800s. And the Poorman Act pretty much said that men who fathered illegitimate children through women, usually through prostitution or when they were dating someone, they could easily not pay for it. Not pay for the child, no responsibilities. And these left women high and dry. Now just imagine being back in those times, being a single woman, and you're pregnant. You know, you have to do desperate things. And, you know, just to get the proper scale of what 1888, you know, looked like. That, you didn't really have much things like abortions. You didn't have abortions. And pretty much babies were found at the sides of the road, just like today we see, you know, roadkill today. If you go for a walk down to your local shops, you probably would see, you know, a dead animal, you know, from being hit by a car. In 1888, it would be a dead baby. Because women couldn't afford children. And in 1888, especially if you were in Whitechapel, where these murders occurred, especially if you were in Whitechapel, this was the poorest of the poor. This was the slums of London. And with life, children, majority of children did not pass the age of 5. If they lived beyond 5 years of age, they were considered very, very lucky. And that's just to prove the squalor of these people, these places, where you would have, in one of those rooms, you would have an entire family living in a room. The entire family, and they usually had large families back in the day. And especially in parts of Whitechapel, it wouldn't be just one family living in a room, and this is one room. It could be up to 5 families living in one tiny room. Men, women, children, all of them. And that's just to prove how poor it was. And to make ends meet, a lot of women, especially if they were poor, because you couldn't do any other type of job. Especially in 1888, majority of the times, and this was also with men, and with women, it was considered a privilege, and it was also a privilege for men, but more likely with women, to have an education. So if you didn't have education, that you were illiterate, which most people at Whitechapel were illiterate, that means there was a lot of jobs that women couldn't do. Like, you couldn't be a nurse if you weren't, if you were illiterate. I think you couldn't even be a midwife if you were illiterate. You know, you couldn't do that. You definitely couldn't be, for example, a governess. You couldn't do that because if you were a governess, you had to, you had to teach the children. How can you teach children if you were illiterate? So you couldn't be a governess. So there was very, very little women could do. And also another factor as well, what was happening in Victorian times, that even if you were literate, and this was for all classes, no matter if you were in the poor class or in the rich class, if you were a woman and you were pregnant and your pregnancy began to show, you were no longer allowed to work. So if you were a nurse, you had to give up your job, regardless. Even if you were single, you had to give up your job. And like I said, that was for all classes, both poor to rich. Alright, this is part 1. Hopefully you enjoyed this so far. Meet me in part 2, where we'll talk more about Jack the Ripper. And I'll go into more grisly details about Jack the Ripper. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Have a great day and blessed be.